Hi everyone, I'm Phil Jump, NWBA Regional Minister. Seidel has asked me if I will offer a brief presentation based on some of the survey work that we did in our association amongst our churches back in April of this year to try and assess something of the impact that COVID has had on church life. I'm not sure if this is taking place on Wednesday or Thursday, but unfortunately I can't be with you in the daytime on Wednesday, as John Weaver and I are at the Christian Resources exhibition leading a seminar and doing some other work around the book that we have recently published. So I hope you don't mind if I offer you a brief update on video. I think the first thing we learned was that exercises like this are far from straightforward. Different people interpreted the same questions quite differently, which meant that we didn't necessarily always find the same kind of information in the same place. But this made us stand back from all of that information and look for some more general trends. And without doubt, the strongest message that emerged was that people matter. Now, that wasn't necessarily directly communicated in the answers to questions. But when we looked at the ways in which churches had reacted when lockdown began, the responses they'd introduced, when we looked at what people had missed or what they were looking forward to reclaiming, it was all about people. And here's some of the highlights of that. At least half of the responses about the overall impact of COVID expressed this in relationship to people, mostly expressing it in positive terms. Closure of buildings and activities had enabled a renewed focus on community and fellowship. There was a renewed recognition and inclusion of those who were previously isolated. There was a longing to come back together, and almost no one expressed this in terms of activity or preaching or music, but simply wanting to be together. And for many, the whole experience of lockdown had created a renewed focus on discipleship rather than activity. And it was relationships rather than activities that had held church communities together. So I'd argue that if there is one standout message that we want to take from the last 18 months, it's that we need to be a church that recognises the importance of people over activities and structures. But there was a flip side to that. As I said a few moments ago, the importance of people was more of an implicit message than one that was overtly expressed. And as we looked at answers more directly, it made me wonder whether we really have got that message. Of the 105 responses that we received, only 12 said that they were unaffected by COVID. However, that is somewhat subjective because, as one respondent expressed it, everyone has been affected by COVID. The key issues that emerged were that there were 20 churches where there had been a death within the congregation, a further 18 where there had been a bereavement of either family members or close friends. There was infection and illness, long COVID, pressure on key workers, loss of employment and income, and of course people talking about the emotional impact of lockdown and isolation. So as Baptist communities, we've pretty much faced the same challenges as everyone else. Yet, when people were asked about how they were seeking to respond, only 12 made any mention of the pain and trauma that's been experienced, and of that 12, only around a third extended this concern to helping members of the wider community. When churches were asked about their immediate priorities once they were able to reopen buildings, you could broadly categorise their responses in this way. Only 16 saw the priority as supporting people in the wake of COVID. 23 very much saw their focus as regrouping as a congregation and bringing some people back together. And okay, maybe some support in the wake of COVID could be implicit in that, but the emphasis was very much rebuilding the congregation rather than pastoral concern for what they'd faced. 33 were very much their priority around restarting activities, and 20 spoke of rethinking strategy and mission. Now, we've got to accept that there might be deeper concerns that weren't expressed with that, but it made me really stop and ask, are we truly a people who weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice? Or are we more interested in just getting people mobilised in our projects and strategies? Now, you can't engage in a process like this, having been a regional minister for 20 years, and not bring your own personal knowledge to the task. And as I reflected on many of the answers, I was struck by the fact that COVID had not so much changed things as made them more obvious and intense. So a church that was well connected with its local community had become even more connected. A church that felt isolated had become even more isolated. This image is of our church at Earlstown on the border of Merseyside in Cheshire, which became a community hub through lockdown. And emotions have intensified too, even in relation to how people relate to our Baptist community. Those who liked us seem to now love us, and those who were critical of us have found even more things to criticise us for. And I sense that a key challenge for those of us with translocal ministry is how we support churches through this season of intensity, because there are equivalent internal challenges within many of our congregations. For some, the interruption to church activities has made them realise how much they love them and desperate to see them restarted. For other people, it has made them value the new opportunities that this has made room for, and they seem equally determined to make sure that things don't restart and the new things continue. Some even noted that a whole different group of people have now come to the fore, and there are going to be some real questions going forward about who the true leaders of the church now are. But I would also say that much of the initial optimism that we were hearing in the early days of lockdown seems to have waned. Churches who had grand plans for developing their online presence and expectations of scores of regular watchers now attending physical gatherings seem to have become much more modest in their expectations when asked about their immediate plans for the next 12 months. Now, there isn't really the scope in this short presentation to go into much more detail of the many responses that we receive, but perhaps some general statistics might also be useful. So we asked churches to summarise how they felt that they would be overall impacted by the pandemic through one of 5 choices, and these are the outcomes. 3 of them pretty much expected that they could continue pretty much unaffected once the pandemic was over. 38, the largest number, expected there to be some impact in the immediate term, but with time they thought that they would regroup and pretty much continue with just a few minor changes. 30 churches did indicate a more significant impact that would cause them to reevaluate and reflect on their mission. 5 indicated that this had already caused them to explore significant change of direction. And 12 indicated that they were really now uncertain about their ongoing viability and future. And I don't know whether that would be repeated right across the UK, but it's an interesting set of statistics. And we also asked churches specifically about the numeric impact. 24 said that they were uncertain, and this was largely through either questioning whether regulars would return once physical gatherings restarted, and for others it revolved around the question of whether and how new online contacts would be integrated into church life. And remember, this took place in April, before churches really were able to reopen. 22 were expecting things to be largely unchanged. 9 suggested that they would be numerically around the same, but it may well be comprised of different people because of the changes that had happened. 16 suggested that numbers had or would reduce. 16 indicated an experience of growth during lockdown. And 5 reported what I've described as an untested optimism. By this I mean that they were expecting growth, but this was largely just sort of saying because we expect God to bring growth, not because of any direct impact of COVID. And then there were 4 that offered other responses. So I hope these few thoughts are of help to us as we think about how we are responding as a Baptist community to COVID. But as I looked at it, it did strike me that for most of our churches and most of our people, what we are responding to is lockdown and not COVID. There are many people whose lives have been impacted by COVID. There are many people whose lives have been impacted by lockdown. And it seems that we do need to have something of a pastoral concern, not to confuse the two, because they may be very, very different experiences for people.